Theoretical explanations accounting for gendered sentencing differences are centered on the chivalry hypothesis, a term coined by scholars in criminal justice, and the patriarchal perspective. Underlying assumptions are based on patriarchy model systems dominated by men, with masculinity being more favored than femininity. The systems are perceived to control women, by minimizing the likeliness of feminine traits compared to masculine traits. Chase maintains that the chivalry thesis, also called paternalism, focuses on traditional gender roles, in advocating for leniency and treating women within justice systems, because they are incapable of harm. As such, they should be convicted on different standards as men. Besides, the hypothesis proposes that women are emotionally weak to commit violent crimes. Proponents of the hypothesis suggest that constant focus on indirect aggression minimizes society's perception of women's culpability criminal behavior. Indirect aggression is associated with acts such as gossip and spreading rumors that result in mental and emotional damage. The dominance of the chivalry hypothesis and the patriarchal perspective accounts for the overrepresentation of men in justice systems, since women should always be protected. Decisions founded on these perspectives are associated with stereotypes, gender roles, and gender bias. Court actors elevate the meaning of past and present defendants, and stereotypes in making sentencing decisions. Applying the chivalry hypothesis, instead of victim-based approaches, less intuitively reflects the need to protect women from harm, which conforms to traditional gender roles and social norms. The evil woman hypothesis or selective chivalry covers the transgression of gender roles. Embry and Lyons note that selective chivalry advocates for harsher sanctions for individuals who break gender roles and stereotypes that warrant leniency under the chivalry hypothesis. The chivalry hypothesis explains why some crimes, such as petty theft, are not perceived as serious, since they cannot be closely associated with gender roles. There are significant gendered differences in sentencing violent compared to non-violent offenders. Effective implementation of selective chivalry would inform a lower gender discrepancies in sentencing violent crimes. The hypothesis is commonly used for women who present female roles, including sexually passive, thereby being non-aggressive. Chivalry-related hypotheses are variably applied in different instances of cases. Differential discretion proposes the disproportional use of chivalry, which is common in dismissing cases at the initial stages, based on the type and severity of the crime. The gap in sentencing sex crimes should be based on the nature of the crimes, instead of the victims' or perpetrators' demographics. This gap could inform female offenders receiving harsher punishments in instances where the crimes are severe. According to Embry and Lyons, the evil woman or selective chivalry hypothesis proposes that paternalistic judges perceive female offenders as weak and in need of protection, except in instances where behavior defies gender roles. Noteworthy, the hypothesis suggests that serious sex crimes committed by women violate gender stereotypes, and as such, they should be punished severely. The evil woman hypothesis informs the assumptions that women are handed heavier sentences in instances where they act against gender norms. The hypothesis was common in the 19th century, in which Dunner and Demuth document a dual system used to punish women. Feminine or trainable women were subjected to reformatories, while masculine women were incarcerated alongside men. This hypothesis should then be a foundation of lenient sentences for male sex offenders, since social norms depict men as sexually aggressive. As such, they are not violating any norms. However, Chase argues that data shows significant differences in implementing the hypothesis. Instances of acting against gender roles should then warrant the punishment of female sex offenders twice. The first approach to punishment should be legal accountability, and the second approach should be based on the violation of the implicit social code. The twofold approach to punishment is essential, considering that court actors treat female sex offenders as gender atypical. The actor's perception should then punish female offenders through a third approach, which focuses on the violation of sexual norms. The actors often link crimes committed by females to internal factors, that is, mental issues and past experiences, or external factors, including the presence of a co-offender or personal conduct. To account for offending instead of criminal involvement being a conscious decision. A lesser-known proposal that accounts for the disparities in sentencing offenders is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance encompasses experiencing mental discomfort, when processing information that violates personal values and/or beliefs. This discomfort is expected when judges process female offenders, because the behavior violates social norms. As a result, judges justify female perpetrators of sexual offenses by minimizing involvement or shifting blame to internal and external factors to reduce dissonance. Sexual script and social role theories are also utilized with the cognitive dissonance explanation to account for disparities in sentencing. However, the social role theory has been criticized in feminine literature, since it attributes behavior to socialization and biological constructs, instead of motivation and intention. Sexual scripts depict females as victims and males as perpetrators, because they are sexually passive. Dunner and DeMuth explain that these scripts are used when courts strive to achieve rational outcomes in situations of information shortage. Court actors also face pressure from stereotypical media and public opinions to attain rationality in cases characterized by a shortage of information. Non-violent female sex offenders are associated with a lesser degree of cognitive dissonance, also called partial dissonance. The gender structures of offender perceptions and offending patterns, irrespective of the nature of offenses or victims, suggest notable disparities in sexual offender punishment according to Ireland. The social perspectives of sex crimes inform approaches to punishing perpetrators, with male offenders receiving harsher punishments compared to their counterparts. Gender disparities are far greater compared to racial disparities. Particularly, Professor Starr explains that gender sentencing disparities are 6 times greater than racial disparities in criminal justice. According to Dunner and DeMuth, court actors assume that women's caregiving and familial responsibilities are difficult to replace, compared to the breadwinning responsibilities of men, which informs reluctance in sentencing. For example, including gender-based personal characteristics, such as the responsibility of childcare, diminishes the likelihood of accurate incarceration outcomes. The number of dependents is a significant determinant of incarceration outcomes for female offenders, but the same is not applicable for men. Reduced likelihood of incarceration and increased leniency are associated with the view that incarcerating mothers or wives breaks families, since they are separated from their children and husbands. Dunner and DeMuth note additional familial roles based on sex-based factors that include support sources, employment status, number of dependents, and household composition, affect sentencing for both male and female offenders. For instance, defendants with families are less likely to be handed pretrial detention, even though it favors women more than men. The daily contribution of a defendant to the family, such as care and economic support, informs leniency by court actors. This leniency is justified on the grounds of social stability that would inform the reluctance to reoffend, and the social cost of breaking families. The chivalry hypothesis is only applicable for women who comply with traditional gender roles. Overall, Dunner and DeMuth observe that female defendants receive lighter sentences, despite the legal factors contributing to gender differences. Frameworks based on the attribution theory suggest that social perceptions on the seriousness and dangerousness of crime and offenders influence legal decisions, since stakeholders in criminal processes rely on individuals' depictions of circumstances to cover knowledge gaps in rapid decision-making processes. The frameworks note that sentencing approaches are centered on irrelevant legal characteristics, such as gender. For instance, Embry and Lyons postulate that the focal concerns framework or perspective presents practical court constraints, blameworthiness, community protection, and offender dangerousness, as the primary dimensions that inform sentencing decision-making. This framework shows that the depiction of female sex offenders as less dangerous influences how they are sentenced in criminal proceedings. The focal concerns framework accounts for extra-legal factors, such as age, race, and gender, that affect sentencing outcomes irrespective of underlying guidelines that advocate for uniformity in dispensing justice. Defendant status in the context of stereotypical and behavioral expectations influences the focal concerns of court actors. Bounded rationality and blameworthy attributions are also based on traditional gender roles, and are credited for the gender disparities in sentencing offenders. Particularly, blameworthy attribution utilizes women's gender roles in society to limit the blameworthiness of their offenses. Blameworthiness conforms to the principle of aligning sentencing decisions with offenders' culpability and degree of consequences to victims. Dunne and Demuth explain that this diminished blameworthiness reflects on the perception of easily deterring women compared to men. The factors affecting blameworthiness viewpoints include defendants' involvement in the crime, criminal history, and nature of the offense. Gender disparities in sentencing are associated with limited information on specific cases, and the tendency to base sentencing decisions on natural assumptions, prejudice, or bias against a specific group. According to Dunne and Demuth, bounded rationality explains approaches used by judges in making sentencing decisions where there is limited information, as in the case of female sex offenders. Judges focus on preventing recidivism and protecting the public against unpredictable offender behavior. Individual accounts for the inclusion of bias in decision-making, which explains the differences in sexual offender punishment. Apart from the attribution theory, the public perceptions discussed earlier guide the views on sex crimes, irrespective of the type of victims. The impact of gender on sex offender punishment is uniquely noticeable in depicting offenders as male, dangerous, and predators. The small proportion of documented female sex offenders, together with lack of public concern, accounts for the offender's perception as less threatening than male offenders. Additional mitigating factors include an early plea, history of good character, cognitive issues, guilty plea, offender's age, contrition, and the victim's conduct. Contrition refers to showing genuine regret or guilt for the involvement in crime and committing to avoiding reoffending. Pleading guilty is a mitigating factor, since it reduces the cost of undertaking the entire criminal process. Awarding sentencing discounts based on contrition is publicly acceptable, since it saves the resources of all the actors. Cooperation in various forms, including active involvement in the investigation and being a state witness, also contributes to contrition. Judges tend to focus on mitigating factors when sentencing female sex offenders, since females present more contrition-related attributes. For instance, male coercion, mental illnesses, personal adversity, and psychological issues greatly account for sentencing female offenders. On the contrary, male sex offenders are perceived as sexually motivated, thus, offending addresses self-serving purposes, which constantly focuses on aggravating factors, even when they are non-aggressive. Mitigating factors in sentencing female offenders are internally attributed to the perpetrators. Attribution, in this case, encompasses allocating causal responsibility and approaches that reveal personal bias. Internal attribution reduces the culpability of female sex offenders, thereby resulting in judicial bias. Statutory bias accounts for the lack of gender neutrality in sex offenses and capital punishment laws. Particularly, the lack of gender neutrality in capital punishment laws accounts for the massive differences between men and women on death row. The conduct of the victim significantly reduces the seriousness of crimes by female sex offenders. Mitigatory and situational factors significantly influence sentencing female sex offenders. Gannon and Cortona observe that court actors perceive victims of female sex offenders, including minors, as more compliant and involved in the crime in terms of conduct, which diminishes the seriousness of male sexual victimization. The authors highlight some instances depicting the prevalence of female sex offenders, and they include: Petronius described the rape of a 7-year-old with women standing around the bed clapping. Bernard reported that 181 women were reported for assaulting children between 1874 to 1884 in France. Freud highlighted cases of governesses, nurses, and servant girls sexually abusing children under their care in 1896. Childcall explored authoritarian women who physically assaulted women for pleasure in 1935. Of particular interest is the case evaluated by Bender and Blau in which a woman had sexual contact with her 6-year-old son in 1937, but the criminal culpability of the mother was diminished through the prescription that the child was actively involved in the activity.